How do you stay up to date with AI news?
I don't.
Welcome to a new episode of Future Ready Lawyer podcast. I'm Armin Alimardani. I'm joined by my co-host Mark Bennett. Today, we are delighted to welcome Associate Professor Amy Salyzyn from the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law. Amy writes and teaches in the areas of legal ethics, lawyer regulation, technology, legal services, and access to justice. Before joining academia, Amy clerked at the Court of Appeal for Ontario and practiced at Toronto Litigation Boutique. So she brings both a scholarly and practical perspective to questions about legal profession. She has become one of the clearest voices in Canada on what generative AI means for lawyers, courts, law schools, and the public. Her work looks beyond both the hype and the panic around AI and asks the harder questions. What does competent lawyers look like when AI can produce convincing but false legal work? How should courts respond to fake cases and AI generated submissions? And how do we prepare law students and lawyers to use those tools responsibly without losing the judgment that legal practice depends on? So we are really happy to have Amy with us today to talk about AI, legal ethics, legal education, and what the Canadian experience can teach us. To begin with, Amy, we just want to get an idea about how things are in Canada in terms of use and misuse of generative AI in courts. We just want to know like how if there's anything different to Australia and other jurisdictions. So if you just could tell us an overview of how Gen AI is currently appearing in Canadian legal practice and litigation, in particular, what kinds of problematic court submissions have you seen involving fake citations, invented authorities, inaccurate summaries, and have Canadian courts responded mainly through practice notices and disclosure requirements, or have we also started to see sanctions, cost consequences, or professional discipline?
Thanks for that. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm a fan of this podcast. I've been listening, trying to keep up with your thoughts and your guest thoughts, and also what's happening in Australia. So I'm very pleased to be joining you from Canada. Yeah, I think a lot was captured in your question. So maybe I'll give a few high level points and we can dig into anything that you might want to. In terms of just usage more broadly in the legal profession, I think like a lot of places, it's hard to get a really detailed read on exactly how Canadian lawyers are using AI. We're not required to report our technology use to a regulator. No one knows exactly what tools any particular lawyer has. We have some small scale surveys. They often tend to be industry driven. And so sometimes you look at those and wonder how much they're actually capturing the full picture. But certainly, I talk to a lot of lawyers across Canada, try and keep track of this. And what we're seeing is over the last few years, kind of overall slowly increased use, certainly of tools, both, some of the general purpose tools like ChatGPT or Copilot, and then some of the more bespoke platforms, Harvey, Legora. Those bigger platforms tend to be more in use by the larger law firms. We also have our federal government, which also houses what they call Canada's largest law firms. So the largest number of law firms work in government in Canada, and they are using various AI tools, including their own. Um, Small firms find sometimes the cost of some of these tools to be a bit outside their budget, but they're certainly doing some of the most exciting things too when it comes to innovation. They're building sometimes their own tools with all the ability to code now. And so we're seeing kind of, innovation across the field. It's very jagged though, because some lawyers aren't using any tools at all. Some people are kind of coding their own tools. Some people are using, expensive commercial tools. So it does really vary, but the arc is overall, increased use. And in terms of it hitting the legal system, our most visible place, like you said, is where lawyers or self-represented litigants file problematic materials with the court, where it has legal authorities that are either made up or misstated because AI was used to generate those and generated those either fake or misstated legal authorities. I think in terms of what we're seeing, I think it's the whole span of, completely made up case citations, sometimes real cases, but the wrong proposition. Sometimes real cases and then full on paragraphs of quotes that are said to come from those cases. One thing we're seeing with the self-represented litigants is trying to use chat tools like ChatGPT to kind of create or analyze evidence. So, they have a small claims case and they want to, get, for example, plumbing specifications of an industry. They'll use ChatGPT kind of as their expert in the case, and courts aren't accepting that, but we're seeing that happen a little bit more. Um, the other thing to point out, even though we're seeing, particularly over the last year, these cases, just like they are internationally, skyrocket, what's reported is only the tip of the iceberg. So much of this is happening where courts are dealing with it more informally, or it might not get published in a decision. And so what we're seeing is certainly indicative of an accelerating trend, but more and more is happening. I guess I'll close off by just talking about how courts and tribunals in Canada are reacting. Yeah, I think a mix of reactions, and often because there's a mix of circumstances in which these incidents arise. And so we've seen, certainly cost consequences, both for people who are self represented and lawyers, with a theory that it's costing more money for the other side to potentially go through all these authorities and find out what's real. There are some cases where lawyers are getting costs awarded against them personally. So that's kind of more of a sanction type of feature where it's not the client paying the cost, but the lawyer is. On the disciplinary side, we don't have any disciplinary cases yet, but there's a few that are in the pipeline. And so we may see some reported disciplinary decisions. Also, with our regulators, there's a variety of sanctions they can also give that don't necessarily get publicized. We don't have a full picture of that as well. One interesting phenomenon, I don't know if this happened in Australia, we've had at least 2 lawyers who are in law society proceedings, so regulatory proceedings, and those proceedings didn't have anything to do with AI, but they used AI improperly in those proceedings. So for example, one lawyer was accused of various misconduct and used Grok to try and make their legal submissions before the Law Society of Ontario. And so we're kind of seeing this pop up anywhere and anywhere, everywhere and anywhere it could possibly happen. So that's kind of a big picture of what we're seeing.
So, Amy, that does link with lots of stuff that we're seeing in New Zealand. I mean, as a smaller jurisdiction, we are seeing fewer of these big cases where the judges highlight, look at this hallucination. Well, we definitely have them. There's a couple of recent Supreme Court cases in that vein. What I'm really interested in is, do you think the tide is turning? Because I know that you've been looking at this, since the start of generative AI came on the scene. And I think there was a podcast from 2023 where you were talking about generative AI in the legal system, and you start thinking time's moving on. 2026, we've had it in some form since then. Do you think things are changing? Do you think, are we going to get a slowdown as people start learning, engaging with continuing professional education and podcasts and understanding it more, where there's a more sophisticated use coming in maybe from lawyers? And then the real problem will still be at that non-expert level of self-represented litigants. So do you see a change happening there?
Yeah, such a good question. I remember when I think the first reported case that kind of came to everybody's attention, at least in North America, was the Avianca case, and the American lawyer that made the front page of the New York Times, I think in May or June 2023, right? And people said, oh my gosh, look at this unfortunate mistake this lawyer made. We're in the early days. Surely everyone will see this headline, and no lawyer is going to make the same mistake and become headline news. Just 6 months after that, we had our first Canadian lawyer also making headline news internationally for doing something similar, relying inappropriately on ChatGPT results. And there's so much work the law societies are doing here to try and get the word out. And again, these cases do make the news to some extent. It does seem there's still, pockets of lawyers that may not fully understand just how easy it is for this technology to potentially hallucinate. And so maybe they are understanding at one level can make fake citations, but not understanding, it's not enough just to check if the cases are real, because you may get fake quotations. And it's, not enough to check that, it stands generally for the statement of law. What if it's changing the legal test a little bit? And so maybe that people have some level of awareness, but just not enough. And then I think why exactly this continues to happen, it doesn't seem to exactly be slowing down quite yet. I think we think about the conditions of practice and people working under a lot of time pressures and with fatigue, and maybe even people who should know better have that easy button that's just so easily beside them and think, this looks good enough. It looks quite good. I'm going to push it through, and not doing that rigorous checking that they'd actually have to do. And so I hope with podcasts like this, and I think people talking in all their jurisdictions about the need to avoid this kind of thing continuing to happen, we'll see a slowdown. I haven't run the numbers kind of really scientifically, but nothing seems to indicate that this is slowing down. Seems to be, if anything, increasing. And of course, there's huge cost to courts, right? The time that some of the courts are needed to spend on trying to vet and deal with these solutions. In Canada, probably like Australia, we have really scarcity of court resources. I worry about public confidence, in the legal profession when they see these headlines of lawyers seemingly just, we're supposed to be well educated, often charge high fees, seemingly just using ChatGPT to do the work for them. It's not many lawyers, it's not all lawyers, but it's those few lawyers that make the headlines. And it's not just lawyers too. Just recently in the spring, we had our first case of a Canadian judge who appeared to have used generative AI in a court decision, and that there was misstated law in that court decision. So we're still waiting to see that play out a bit, but there's big consequences. So I'm hoping we can see the tide stem. But I don't know. Are you seeing a slowdown, you think, in Australia or New Zealand at all?
We don't. And I did this interview with ABC Law Report in Australia back in 2023. It was like, I think, in September or November. And we had this case that was huge back then. It was one of the very first cases in Australia. And when they asked me, what do you think it's going to slow down? I was like, I think it's just going to increase. I don't think the AI literacy is the only problem. The technology is so different to many other technologies because it talks in natural language to you. And the better the technology gets, you trust it even further. And that's where we will hit hard because people are going to verify less as the technology gets better. So just exactly same as you said, I don't think it's going to slow down. And in our experience, it's been increasing.
Yeah, so in New Zealand, I've seen recent discussion about the disputes tribunal, which is very sort of low level civil matters under a certain amount. I think it's $50,000 now, New Zealand dollars. So where you're suing your neighbour for paying for half the fence or whatever, apparently there's a lot more volume of arguments coming through from pretty much everyone self-represented at that level. And so people are commenting, the disputes tribunal is just drowning in this stuff. And so I'm sure that's going to be an expanse. AI is going to expand there. I think when we talk about hallucinations particularly hallucinations, but maybe also getting the law wrong, I think there's going to be, for these bigger law firms and just more, most lawyers are trying to do a good job and read the cases before they cite them to the judge. We're going to see that drop away. I also think that the models are trying to tamp down on the hallucinations, and apparently there's been some decent breakthroughs, although we can't get rid of them completely. So we'll see what happens there.
Part of your thought that I'm picking up on is this fact that even as a technology, certainly for more expert users, becomes more advanced, as people become more aware, maybe deal with that accuracy piece a little bit, there's that volume piece that still is causing a huge strain on the system. And if you look at in Canada, I'm sure it's similar in your jurisdictions, the amount of unmet legal need we have is significant. There's so many people not getting resolutions to their legal problems. What does the world look like where everybody who wants to file a lawsuit with a court can suddenly do so? And it can suddenly do so, theoretically with a snap of a finger. So very quickly, the friction to be doing this is down. And we're seeing, I think, particularly with some of our regulatory bodies, the number of complaints they're receiving from the public are increasing. The volume of them are increasing. And so a few different things going on. I think part of the challenge too is not only is the volume increasing, but it can be more difficult for, I think, just like you were suggesting, Mark, for people to parse through what is a nugget of that complaint when it's 300 pages long and ChatGPT's generated it. We haven't talked yet about the fact that the technology is sycophantic sometimes. And so sometimes it can get very difficult where regulators genuinely trying to help somebody and explain maybe they don't have jurisdiction over something, or maybe try this instead of that. And unfortunately, the technology is putting that person in a feedback loop where they're very distrustful of the regulator. They're not listening to anything they say. They're doubling down because the technology is convincing them that they're right. And so it becomes very difficult then to get towards a resolution. And so I think we're in for interesting times ahead. I think part of the way some of the regulators are trying to break through in Canada is to the extent they can actually just have a phone call with somebody. Sometimes that can actually help, get to the core of the problem rather than exchanging, 300-page complaints or having emails that are going nowhere. But that's not going to be feasible in every case. It kind of depends on what you're dealing with.
Just a follow-up question. The way the technology is being advertised is it helps with efficiency. You get things done way faster. You don't need to look into a lot of cases. AI will do it for you. But if you want to do it properly, as we discussed, then you would need to verify not only the citations, but also the content of each citation, which can be extremely time consuming. How do you find the efficiency gain of using language models in legal contexts?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, one that everybody is concerned with from a variety of different perspectives. I think one reason I found it a bit challenging to talk about is because, of course, this is a general purpose technology in a general sense, right? And so I think if you look at Legal Technology Hub's recent inventory of generative AI tools in law, there's over 1,000 different tools doing so many different things. And so legal research tends to be where our brain goes, I think, with this technology, because we are seeing the technology fail in these court cases, and it's a very kind of digestible type of use case. And so I do think, if there are potentially legal research applications are useful, but if you think you're going to, have just a model where you're trying to pull up a full produced memo or a brief on a legal matter, if you're on that big block of text, you're going to need to do the verification to make sure that's correct. And that's going to wipe out any efficiency gains, because it's not just checking the cases. What if it's missing something? If I have legal AI tool say, here's 3 paragraphs of what the law is in this area, if I'm not already an expert in it, I don't know if they're missing a 4th paragraph that actually tells me something really important. So even if I went and checked to make sure the propositions were right, which again could be a time consuming matter, then, it's still not necessarily going to be the safest application when you're talking about a profession and a use where accuracy is paramount. Conversely, if you've already done your legal research maybe a more traditional way and you just want to see if you're missing a case, or if you want help, this is very narrow, but help with kind of developing Boolean terms, and you want to use plain language to do that, there are kind of legal research applications potentially. Or you have your legal brief and you want to kind of have an adversarial use and say, what's weak about my brief? Can you give me some suggestions? There are different things you can do, even in the legal research space. But I think the idea that we can kind of just produce a full legal research product, um, you know, is not going to be an efficient way to use a technology if you're doing that kind of verification.
So when you talk about the verification issues, how are you getting a sense of that yourself? Because I've got access to the frontier models, the $20 US plans. I don't have access to the major legal providers in New Zealand, Thomson Reuters and LexisNexis. They've launched their AI products in New Zealand. I do have access to a little New Zealand, well, they're quite reasonably big now, a startup called Law Cyborg, and so I'm playing with that. But obviously I'm not a practicing lawyer, so I don't really have that sense of, within a lawyer's workflow, how does that generation and verification process work? I'm just playing much more with my own teaching, my own research, which is similar in some ways to some of legal practice, but a lot different in other ways. So my question is, how are you developing that sense of where the technology is at and how people are using it? Is that your own use of tools yourself, either in practice or for your preparation for learning and teaching? Is that talking to lawyers at these events that you're at? How do you get that sense of where frontier legal AI is at in terms of how people are using it?
So your question was, thinking about how does verification actually work in practice, and how do I try and develop a sense of what's happening when lawyers are trying to use this technology responsibly, or what are some of the best practices? And so kind of part of what I do is make sure I always have a hand in the technology a little bit. And so using different tools, seeing how they operate, but I certainly don't use every type of tool out there. My background's in litigation, so I'm mostly intuitively familiar with like how a litigator might use this tool as opposed to somebody who's on the transactional side. So a lot of it does come with talking with lawyers in different practice areas. And I think the ways that people are using this technology in some ways are a little bit endless. So it's not kind of these necessarily big tasks like write me a legal research memo. People may be using it for much more discrete moments of time in their workflow. And so I have this document. Can I have better language for this sentence? Can you cut some words out here? Even the grammar check kind of stuff. Or I have this big set of documents. Can you find me examples of something in this set of documents? So that's an easy verification task in the sense you ask for an example and then you go to that whatever page it tells you in the transcript or whatever document in the productions, you verify if that's there. if that's going to be kind of a verification task. Jack Shepard is someone whose writings I follow a lot in AI, and I recommend that to anybody. He, a few years back, talked about thinking about both easy and hard verification tasks. And thinking first, are you even in a task where accuracy matters? Because in some cases, when you're doing that wording, accuracy is not going to be paramount. But, if you're in a place where the verification is easy, so again, just confirming that examples at that page it says it is, that's going to be a task where you can do the verification fairly straightforwardly and the efficiency gain is going to be there. If it's going to be that big block of text where you have to make sure you have all of the law in that big block of text, that's going to be hard to verify and it's probably just not a good use case. And so, you're not going to be wanting to use that technology for that. And so I think it's going to depend on the different practice areas. But when you are at a moment where accuracy is salient, you have to make sure that you're verifying completely.
So, Amy, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the concept of vibe coding, which means you just talk in natural language and the AI creates the app for you. Do you think lawyers and law students will create their own applications that fit their work routine or process and to create something that addresses some of the limitations that we just talked about and it's fit for their specific purpose? Like my students have been creating very cool stuff. I just created 2 research tools that the generic models cannot do. So what do you think, like how legal profession would look like in a few years when everybody gets their hands on vibe coding, creating their own things?
Yeah, great question. I think I never try and make prognostications about what the legal profession is going to look in like 6 months, let alone 2 or 5 years. I think it's really hard to predict where this is going. I think in Canada, like other places, there's some lawyers doing some pretty cool stuff about kind of building their own agents, vibe coding, creating workflows that are really working for them and doing that in a way now they couldn't do it before. That's a small percentage of lawyers. I think in general, we have a profession that is a little bit risk averse, I think I could say, and maybe, and I don't mean this in an insulting way, but maybe change adverse as well. And so the idea that we're going to see kind of profession wide vibe coding kind of anytime soon, I'm a bit more hesitant to see a future there. I think people like to go with the names they trust, at least now. What's that saying? You're never going to go wrong buying IBM or something like that. There's that saying in branding, no one's going to sue you for kind of hiring a company that has a well-deserved reputation versus building your own thing. And if something goes wrong on the security front or something goes wrong in the quality front, a lot more liability on you. But I would hope, I think it may also not be a either or, could be an and proposition where people are using, some of the commercial tools, the tools that are developed by third parties for some tasks, and then kind of building their own particular, smaller tools for getting particular things done in their workplace. So yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see where it goes. I think there's lots of opportunity, but also lots of liability. If we think about a whole, tens of thousands of lawyers kind of creating their own agentic systems and letting those loose in the world.
I think it would be a new type of problem. Like we see hallucinated cases, content being submitted to courts, and then we have a new wave of vibe coded apps that are not secure, and like they're going to be a huge cybersecurity problem.
This is such a fascinating topic and time to be alive because, it's sort of like that pre-Google era where you have Alta Vista and Yahoo and all these different providers of a particular product. And it's like, well, is any of them going to be around in a few years? And then like with this distinction between build or buy, and you've got a big law firm in America, I think, saying we're going to build, we're going to spend $500 million building our own tool on top of all these layers of technology that we have access to. And we're not going to use vibe coders so much. We're going to use professional coders. They'll do their own vibe coding, but it's going to be a robust product. And then you've got the small firms saying, this is how you set up a law firm. I just saw a LinkedIn post. You buy your computer, your accounting subscription, you buy Claude, a team enterprise license, and then you're away. And people are trying to figure out ways of doing that securely and effectively. And Claude jumping in with its legal plugins, right?
Yep.
And then you've got those big players doing a massive bet and investors are piling into them, the Legora and the Harvey and there's a few others. We roll the roulette wheel if you're the investor in that. Which of those is going to be around in 3 to 5 years, 10 years even? it just sort of blows my mind that we're at the start of that curve of uptake and usage and, what's going to happen. Watch the space.
Yeah, I think it's, I mean, and the open source aspect of all this, added on to it. And I think there's a variety of paths that this could go, and probably it's going to be a combination of paths. I think one hope is that this technology can quote unquote, level the playing field. And so we're not just seeing a workplace that has to invest $500 million in developing their own tool to get quality products, or, governments as well sometimes have deep pockets to develop their own tools and lots of data. Can we have, the solos and small practitioners and also the public have tools that are actually helping them? And I think, with this increasing ability to build tools, that holds a lot of promise. And hopefully you're also moving to a world where legal data is getting more accessible. There's still big issues with that as well. We can get to kind of a more democratized legal tech world. It's pretty unclear where we're going now, but I think there's a lot of different exciting projects, whether it's the coding or the open source or the access to justice work being done. So, yeah, I teach a course every year on AI in the legal profession, and each year, but when I redo the syllabus or start a new class, there's always something completely unexpected and new that I can talk to the students about because things are moving fast.
That access to justice aspect of it is another side of the tsunami of submissions coming into the courts from people without legal training. But I just saw that, is it Canley, the free legal information service in Canada, which is very good, I think quite well funded version of that. They've just put in place their own generative AI tool or chatbot, as far as I can understand. Have you had a play around with that? Because that seems like it will really help those self-represented litigants, but also obviously small law firms as well.
Yeah, that was a really exciting development. So CanLE is kind of our legal database that has legislation and court cases and also commentary. It's funded by the Canadian Law Societies, which is funded by lawyers. And so it's available to the public. They've been, I think, in a really good way, kind of slowly moving to the AI space. The first thing they did was generate AI summaries of cases and legislation, kind of making it easier. They more recently built in some AI search functionality, but it's much more probably narrow than you kind of see, ChatGPT giving, legal advice to somebody, quote unquote. It's helping people with those Boolean searches. It's helping kind of rank searches, that kind of thing. But I think great that they're moving into that space and offering that to more people, and certainly, yeah, both the public but also smaller law firms. And there's a few other interesting projects in Canada as well. In BC, actually, one of the nonprofit legal information providers now has its own generative AI chatbot. The provider's called People's Law School, and the chatbot's called Beagle Plus. And they've served kind of thousands of people in that province, and the tool provides legal information in a way that people can digest quite easily. It's very much tied to curated sources. It's helping people fill out court forms. And so, you know, that's a nonprofit that has some kind of government funding and other funding behind it, but it's doing something in the space where it's not a robot lawyer start to finish in a case, but if it can help people understand if what their landlord's doing is legal or not legal and point them to the right court form, that can be a huge service rather than someone wading through, pages and pages of text on a web page.
I mean, talking about your subject here, you just mentioned it. Could you tell us a little more? What do you teach in your subject, law, AI, and professional responsibility?
Yeah, well, I have a couple different courses. One is called AI in the legal profession. I should probably get a fancier title for it, but I try and be descriptive. And we have a lot of students interested in taking it. And we have a lot of different. We have several other courses at our law school too that are trying to help students engage, and understand with this technology. In that particular course, I'm trying to approach the students coming from kind of any level of technical expertise or exposure to the technology. And so we do a few different things throughout the term. The first thing we just do is try and get a hold and understanding of what artificial intelligence is. Kind of the general concept is history a little bit, understanding where this term came from, understanding some of the flexibility and development of this term, and then getting a little bit more into more detail about how generative AI works, including working on an educational platform called LawKey. It's LAWQI, where students can kind of work the technology in a safe manner and also get different educational modules included. from that, we try and look at how this technology is being used in different contexts in Canada. So, immigration officials, there's a huge usage of AI in that space. The criminal justice system, the courts, thinking about how it's potentially used in legislation. So, rules as code, we introduce students to before kind of getting into more specifically the tools for lawyers, how lawyers might use them. My background most fundamentally is in professional responsibility, so really, hitting that area in a lot of detail. So talking about what are your competence obligations now, confidentiality, candor is a big one. To clients, to courts, also within a law firm, talking about what should you be delegating, and also then you know trying to have students attuned to all this with a critical eye. So what are some of the bigger normative social questions emerging with this technology? The environmental impacts, the bias, the use by government officials as well, because those are going to be the social and policy questions they're going to be facing in practice as well. And so I want to make sure they can actively become part of the conversation. So we hit a lot of different topics with the idea of letting students get exposed to all the ways that this technology is interacting with our justice system. And it's a lot of fun.
So do you teach the students anything about like how to use the models? Like is it through the platform Lucky you just mentioned?
That's our fundamental. So we don't go into kind of extensive skill building modules in this particular course, but we do several modules within that educational platform. They are learning about things like prompting. They are learning about how the models operate. They can also build their own assistant within that. There's a kind of a lesson plan where they can do that. So also learning a little bit about not quite vibe coding, but kind of building your own as well, just to get a bit of exposure to the technology, because I do think using it is one of the key ways you can actually understand both what this technology might mean beneficially, but also some of the limitations. And so we do a bit of that for sure. Yeah.
So you mentioned the students are using it already and might be bringing that knowledge to their workplace. And I think there's a sense for a university educator, there's a question of pedagogy, because there's ideas out there on the internet that you should never use AI when you're learning. It causes brain rot. It prevents you from doing the hard work of thinking yourself. And there's others who are much more boosters of using AI in schools and in universities and having it as one tool. So what do you think about when students should be engaging with AI? Is it something they should be doing from the start in certain ways? Should there be a time where they're not using it at all? Is it embedded throughout, or is it at particular times? You must have thought about this a lot, being so involved in the space.
Yeah, I mean, I think all legal educators are thinking about this a lot nowadays. Just last week, I was at a conference of Canadian law teachers, and this subject was on everybody's mind. I don't think anybody believes they've got it completely figured out to a T about the exact right way to approach this. I think there's a growing sense, and I think a correct sense, that if we are teaching law students, there's certain fundamental things they just need to be learning and doing. I say they kind of have to do the reps, right? They have to, be able to read a case and distill the important aspects of it. And so I would never suggest that what a first year law student should do is never read a case and just get AI summaries of every case. I think they all need to learn how to write and think critically as a lawyer and analyze things. And so be doing those things in the more quote unquote traditional ways. That doesn't mean they shouldn't, be learning about AI or using AI in certain aspects of their education. So, for example, maybe first year you have a legal research and writing course or a legal research course. I think would want to be learning a variety of ways of conducting legal research, and maybe AI assisted legal research is part of that, showing both the functionality of these tools, but also some of the risks, and highlighting for those students some of the ways that lawyers went wrong. I think, getting introduced to the technology in terms of how it works and experimenting with some of the tools is a positive. And I think having opportunities for students to do that as well. But I think it's really good. I think in any case, you have to think kind of what's the pedagogical goal of my course or this assignment, and does AI fit with that? And use that term brain rot, but cognitive foreclosure is the fancier way. People aren't going to develop the skills if they don't get a chance to actually to do that work. And so it's really important we preserve that and create the conditions where students are put in a place where they are building those skills is going to be really important. But I think it's very dynamic, and I think we're all, I think many of us are concerned about doing it the right way, and I think we're figuring our way through it.
And you've seen these students booing graduation speakers when they're saying this is the next industrial revolution and just mentioning AI at all, unless you're saying get rid of AI, like that recent Harvard speaker did. Do you get any comments or concerns from students, refusal to use it at all for ethical issues or for these pedagogical learning issues? Like, because there's quite a strong resistance movement. I don't know if you experience that, and if so, how you deal with people who just hate AI.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. Personally, I haven't had any direct experience, but it is something I've been thinking about is how we make space for people that have those critiques and have that critical perspective. And because, you know, there are real concerns about this technology in terms of how it was built and what is its effect on the environment, what is its effect on the labor force. And I think, how this gets approached, I think it's going to be context specific, but I think maybe in terms of some of my preliminary thoughts on this, I think, yeah, first we give space to that perspective and talk about those concerns and get exposure to those concerns. It's an important part of the conversation. I do think if someone's going to be part of the legal profession, the status right now is this technology is part of the world they're entering. So it may not even be if they want to be using a tool, they may make a choice that they're not going to use these tools. And I don't think there's any proactive ethical obligation right now to use any particular tool, but it may be their clients coming to them with AI generated material, or maybe the opposing counsel uses this material. Maybe that they're working on the policy side of things and AI is impacting the policy advice they're giving. And so I think having some understanding of this technology is going to be really important, particularly if you want to be shaping how this technology is used and kind of pushing back against industry. I think some of that knowledge is needed for sure. I might add, sometimes when I talk to law students or lawyers about this technology, one thing I wrap up is stepping back a bit and thinking about what kind of mindset we might bring to this technology and to this moment we're at. And I'm a person who likes alliteration, so I've kind of come up with this, what I call the 3C mindset, where I think in terms of the mindset we should bring, I think first and foremost, it's healthy and productive for us to be curious about this technology. I think that puts us in a learning mode. And, for people that may be overwhelmed about all the technical advances and things they hear, if you're curious, you are in a position to continue to learn. And I think if you're curious, you're also becoming an active participant in the conversations about how AI should be used. So I think it's really important that law students, lawyers, the judiciary don't take a backseat to industry and other voices about how this technology is going to be integrated into these important public institutions. So I think being curious is a great approach. I try and stay curious about this technology. I think second, there's a lot of anxiety around this technology. I think we can be the second C is to be, let's have a bit of confidence. We're a legal profession and legal education system that's weathered a lot of different changes in the past. For some time, we didn't have computers. For a long time, we didn't have computers. We faced the onset of the COVID pandemic and figured out how to adjust our practices. So even with technology, we're always evolving. I think we'll be able to figure this one out. And so being curious and confident. And then the last C is a bit of caution, I think, is the name of the game right now. I think there's a lot of things we're still learning about this technology. The technology itself is evolving quite quickly. And so a lot of hype around the technology. It's perfectly okay to take a breath, take a step back, and be cautious about how we talk about the technology or how we use the technology, while still being curious and confident that we can engage with this technology in a way that is going to, I think, maximize its benefits and also minimize its risks. So in terms of mindset, that's would be my humble suggestion to people going forward.
Honestly, I cannot agree more, especially on the front that students and lawyers should take the front seat in determining how their technology should be used and implemented. I always tell students that you are, the people gonna end up with this technology more than any other generation. And I want you to learn that you have rights and you have to raise your voice and direct where the technology is going has impacting you. Just don't sit back and watch. You can change things if you have that mindset.
So we've come to the end of our time, and it's just been so interesting to hear your perspective, and then ending on your 3 Cs. I think I'm going to take those away. Thanks so much for your time and your insights today.
Thank you for having me. I wish we had even more time to talk, and hopefully we do in the future, because I could learn even more about how you're approaching the issues in your jurisdiction. So thanks so much for having me, and look forward to future conversations.